Awareness, the final frontier. This is Awareness Explorers.
Well, welcome back to Awareness Explorers. I'm your co-host, Jonathan. I'm with my friend and co-host,
Brian Tom O'Connor.
And we get not just two for the price of one of us, but two guests today that I'll introduce in a moment. And we've only had two guests at the same time a couple of times before. And it leads to a great conversation because both of them work together at times, and they are both people I know pretty well. So let me introduce each of them. If you're in the Finders community, you probably know both of them. The first one is Colette Martin. And Colette came to the spiritual and consciousness work, doing a lot of stuff, healing art studies, yoga, healing modalities, to wildly bizarre studies with psychic surgeons and all kinds of strange stuff. She also was an event coordinator for a number of spiritual teachers, mediums, and channels. And their guidance provided a unique opportunity for immersion into spiritual practice and a contemplative life. She's also been with me in the Finders course, the Exemplar course, and other courses. And I'm glad that you're here, Colette. It's going to be fun talking to you. And Boris, I don't know your last name, Boris. Is it Feldman?
That's right.
I got it. Okay. Well, Boris is really a consciousness coach that does work with Colette. He started out working with people and their dogs, and then he realized it was easier to work with the owners of the dogs to help the dogs. So he did that. He relates to, well, he's had a lot of different jobs, but for Awareness Explorers, after he met our guest Rastal, who we interviewed a few episodes ago, he helped put together materials on group and individual coaching for awakening. And he works with Colette to help individuals and groups to awaken using some of those methods. So welcome to Awareness Explorers, both of you. Good to see you.
Great
Thank
to
you.
be here. Thanks for having us.
Now, just so our listeners know, and Brian knows, that Colette, Boris, and I were at a conference last week in Denver called Amplify, which had a lot of people in what's called the Perfectly Okay or Finders community. And you did a workshop on sinking in, which I didn't attend because there was like 5 things going on in every hour. And I figured, well, I could get the information I needed from you this week rather than be there last week. I think I attended Sanjay's episode at that point. But how'd that sinking in episode go, or that workshop go? And what are you learning in this process of trying to coach other people on how to awaken?
I mean, I think for me, and probably for all of us, it was kind of an experiment in trying to see what happens when we take the process that was really designed at the outset to be a one-on-one coaching process for our clients and try to explore it in a group setting. We've done a little bit of experimentation with this at other meetings, other meetups online and such, just in like very short formats. But it was the first time that all three of us, Rastal, Colette, and I, sort of did a tag team on the deepening process, which Rastal probably described in more detail when he was here. And for us, it was an experiment both in the format, because we took different parts or different legs of the process and did them. And then also just in terms of the mechanism or the logistics of it. And then also in terms of how it affected people, because usually we're just sitting with someone one-on-one, most often over Zoom, and leading somebody very precisely through this process. So to do it in like a group setting and kind of tag team through it, it kind of was an interesting experiment in just flexibility and openness and being available for whatever shows up. And I have to say, I was really impressed with how it turned out. I think we got some great feedback from people.
That's great. I did some sessions with Rastal, and he did a guided meditation in Awareness Explorers that people can find on our website, awarenessexplorers.com. And I was curious, can that be done in a group setting? It's basically a guided meditation at that point. And what do you see as what works or what might not work in a group setting?
Hmm. Well, I shied away from group settings because I'm really sort of tracking the person that I'm working with, and that obviously is a bit harder in a group setting. We got a lot of great feedback from that. I'm getting feedback this week from people who say they're still deepening with that process, that group process.
So it might work better than you thought in a
It
group.
it seems like it has. So I
Mhm.
better get used to it.
Yeah, yeah. That could be a great boon to consciousness work because the sinking in process really took the community, the finders community that we're all in, a little bit by storm. You know, it really people said, "Wow, that's the way to keep going deeper." And I think that was almost like a little surprising to a lot of people. Was that your impression?
Jeffrey always said, sink in, sink in, sink in. He said that was the most effective thing he knew. And it's turning out to, I mean, Ristall's really proved that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Brian, you've done this a little bit. What you're newest to this. What have you found about it?
Yeah, I've done the well, my only exposure really was when Rastal did the sinking in guided meditation when he was on this podcast. But I would love to sort of just for listeners who may not be familiar with it. So we call it you're calling it the sinking in process or the deepening process or either or. Is that
Well, yeah, it may help to
terminology?
sort of yeah, it may help to delineate these things a little bit. So
Mhm.
sinking in is essentially a very simple thing that Jeffrey Martin advocated in his Finder's course in 45 Days to Awakening, which is essentially just sort of tuning into what is the quality of fundamental well-being that's available to you at any time. So whatever that looks like, and no matter where it is in terms of any map or framework, is basically just paying attention to it, right? It's like what's there other than, thoughts, emotions, and sensations, right? And tuning into that and doing that as frequently and for as long as possible. And so that's what I think many people in the community, I was a big fan of that process because it's so basic and so obvious and so available. You actually don't need to know anything about anything to do that, right? You simply
Yeah, I
need
don't even
to
use the term fundamental well-being. I say to people, clients I'm working with, is there anything in your experience that kind of feels good or relaxed or open? Tune
yeah,
into that. So you have
yeah,
to
sure.
adjust your words to the audience that you're speaking to.
Yeah, and a lot of those things you're mentioning, I feel like are sort of the somatic or emotional or thought-based correlates to what we're calling fundamental well-being, right? So when you feel a sense of this like openness, this wide open spaciousness, you might also notice a sense of, relaxation or contentedness or even a little bit of joy, something like that, right? So it's just tuning into the underlying kind of atmosphere of everything else you're experiencing. Yeah.
One of the things I found surprising is that people might do that for a little bit of time, but the sessions I did with Roster were they were 90 minutes, and if you just stay with whatever feels well-being, it does change. It doesn't stay the same, and it does tend to deepen, and it deepens sometimes in very surprising ways if you can keep staying with it. And I guess that's probably what you're finding with the clients you work with.
Absolutely. And generally, if the session goes, sort of well, smoothly and as usual, we can get 2 to 3, we call them dives in, where the person will sink in. They will describe the attributes of what they're experiencing as far as fundamental well-being is concerned. Um, there may be some questioning there, and then another dive, and it changes with every dive, and it's very surprising. You can have people come in solidly in location 1 or 2 and they're seeing glimpses way down the line. That doesn't mean they're necessarily living from there from that point on. But I find that those glimpses have a profound gravitational pull, and that's what leads people down the continuum.
Yeah, I just to tell my experience, I mostly live in location one, although I have glimpses of two, three, and four. And what that means is, just the start of awakening. And it kind of deepens as you go into higher number locations. Well, with Rostal's help, I got to what he called location 10. And, location 10 is really out there. There's no time, there's no thing, there's, everything's like, it's like a lot of drugs.
I wonder if that's amazing. It's sort of even hard to believe, but I'm wondering, although I do believe you, of course, but I'm wondering if we might, for listeners who are not that familiar, I know that this came out of the community of finders, which is based on the research by Jeffrey Martin and the Finders course, which is the original course, and then that became the 45 Days to Awakening course. And then there's a group of a community called Perfectly Okay, which is former finders and now has opened up into the general public. But I was wondering two things. One is the deepening or the sinking in process. Who is it for? What are the prerequisites? And would anybody be willing to give a real brief, for people who don't know, description of what we talk about when we talk about locations?
Yeah, sure.
Go for it, Boris.
So when we're talking about locations, you may have had other guests before that have talked about Jeffrey Martin's Martin Matrix as sort of the basis for the Finders course and the whole community that kind of grew up around that. It basically describes what happens to somebody's system once they're in what he terms fundamental well-being, which we sort of put in a more general category of what we're sort of calling equanimity, right? So typically, most people's experience is that they are essentially consumed with or view their entire experience, their lived experience, as sort of the sum total of like thoughts, emotions, and feelings, right? And so that's kind of what their whole experience looks like. So it's kind of what the narrative mind is doing with sensory input. So moving into fundamental well-being, which is location one in that framework, is basically where you move away from being concerned with just feeling okay to where there's a persistent sense of okayness or fundamental well-being that becomes your baseline. It doesn't mean that all your problems go away or there's no longer, stress or anxiety or even, you could say depression and things like that could still be, those elements could still be there, but you're no longer preoccupied with just feeling okay, right? And then location one is sort of the beginning of that process. Location two is where there's less of a sense of somebody inside that's experiencing all that. So it's sort of the beginning of, as Jeffrey describes it, non-dual perception, where that begins. And of course, there's a lot more intricacy to this. There's the layers model as well, which adds another perspective to each location. And you can probably point listeners to some more information about that. But basically, as you go up in locations, sort of different parts of the system either tend to weaken or dissolve, such as the narrative mind, the sense of self, the sort of attachment or constriction of emotions and projections and those sorts of things. And then what tends to happen is more opening towards either a new level of either emotional or sort of aroused, joyous, blissful, full experience, or sort of more deconstruction of some of those structures that in a lot of traditions are described as illusory or delusory, right? So the sense that things work in this particular way. And once those changes happen in your perceptual system, then you perceive the world to be maybe less dense, less constricted, and less limited, right? So it's sort of both things happen, both a kind of falling away of some of the limiting structures in our perception, and also, I would say, this expansion towards more and more of what people usually associate with awakening, these kinds of moving towards contentedness that's sort of persistent and undisruptible.
That was a really good description, Boris.
Okay.
You must have done that before. And the only thing I would add is that, we use the words awakening and enlightenment. And just like Eskimos have 50 words for snow, as you get more into awakening and enlightenment, there's more distinctions. There's different types, there's different ways of experiencing the world. So the locations are attempts to describe different types or experiences on the awakening journey. And there's no necessarily better or worse. Each location has its place or has its advantages and even potentially disadvantages. But it's a map, and maps are useful if you're trying to get somewhere, but no map is perfect. So, but I thought that was a really good description. And I know both of you have had major awakening experiences. And I believe that both of you, your awakening experiences were somehow accelerated through trauma. And I'm wondering if you can speak about maybe what you see as the role of trauma in awakening.
That's a good one.
Yeah. And I've always been surprised in my talking to teachers that it's not an uncommon thing. A lot of awakened people got there through either really bad childhood trauma or some trauma in their life that really shook them into a whole other way of being in the world.
Right, right. I transitioned very early on into the 45-day course. I think it was day 8. And it was a very traumatic and dramatic time in our family. I lost a daughter, my middle child, I lost to cancer during that time. She had been sick for a very long time, and it was a very protracted illness. And it was very sudden. It was very glitchy and weird at the moment of transition. I transitioned into location 4, and I can't say for sure that I wasn't in some form of fundamental well-being, but when you're going through a situation like that in your family, all of that stuff sort of gets clouded, shall we say. But I didn't trust it, Jonathan. It just had all the trappings of a spiritual bypass. And every chance I could get Jeffrey's attention, I did. And I asked him, is this real? Is this real? And it took, I think, me bugging him several times for him to say, it's not only real, this isn't uncommon. It's not uncommon for people who transition during times of trauma to transition pretty far out there on the continuum. And at that point, that was 2021. Location 4 was considered really far out there, and especially for an initial transition. He wasn't seeing that a lot. Things have changed in the community a great deal since those days. But it is apparently not uncommon. I met Rustal because I reached out to him after he gave a talk on POK on trauma and transition. And then I began just conversing with him. He sent me to Luciano. I began conversing with Luciano. I conversed also with Annemiek in our community. And the transitions post that were pretty much, I would say, due to transition, due to connection with people who were in further locations. So I transitioned once through the course, and then after that, it just kept going after a certain point. But I was in location 4 for I'd say 2 years, and then it deepened into something that was even much more nothingness, which Restall turned non-existence. And it was the people who really sort of broke the glass ceiling, Restall, Luciano, and Eric, who just listening to the three of them was what moved the needle for me here.
Which underscores one of the greatest methods in awakening is hang out with awakened people.
Right.
And people who have been there can kind of guide you through the sometimes rough territory.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your experience, Boris? I know in talking to you at the conference that you have a rather late location experience. How did that happen?
Well, I did not have any discernible, sort of major trauma in my experience, nor any discernible major transition. So I'm here representing all the subtle shifting folks. So shout out to those people, and the ones who are never sure anything has happened at all. So that was often what my response was to when I was asked, well, what is this like in your experience? And someone would say, oh, that must mean you've moved or transitioned or progressed here. And I would say, well, I don't know about that. I don't notice anything really. So my experience really of probably almost all of the shifts has been towards a increasing sense of ordinariness, or you might say naturalness. And it seems to sort of be ongoing in this very kind of impersonal, non-doing, non-directional kind of way. But I will say that, I did feel like the 45-day course was really instrumental. Like some things happened, like for the first time, I had attempted meditating before, but it was the first time I realized I had actually never sat for an entire hour before, nor did I probably have the capacity to. So after that, I felt like I could actually meditate. I could actually notice what's going on sort of in this inner world or inner experience. So I would say there was definitely something had happened, but I couldn't really describe how, other than it began to feel more normal. And that sort of has been my experience throughout. And I think some of that is reflected in my experience with our deepening clients, the coachees, is that I don't notice a lot of what Jeffrey calls high arousal kind of experiences in this process. It's really, so far, it's been very surprisingly sort of smooth and swift sailing, so to speak, at least along this particular type of progression. So for me, this feels like, sort of the perfect complement to people who are not necessarily attached or looking for these blowout experiences.
Yeah. I can relate in that my awakening, to the extent that has happened, has been very gradual. And I've actually had to have other people tell me that very different. Like my wife has told me in the last year, I cannot trigger you at all, ever. And it's disturbing to her. Like there's just no trigger that, gets me anymore, at least in relationship to her. And I go, yeah, I guess I used to be triggered a fair amount by you, but that's not happening. And, since when it's gradual, it's really hard to see those changes. It's actually easier for other people to spot them. A few years ago, I had an email list of some 20,000 people, and my assistant accidentally erased it, which took like 20 years to get, And after about a day of being bummed out about it, I just found it hysterically funny. And there was like, my income as well, and my whole 20 years of stuff. And I said, gee, that would have been the type of thing that used to upset me for a long time. So something happened where I realized, oh yeah, I'm not triggered by that either. But I'm still triggered by some things, slow customer service, for example. But yeah, the gradual way doesn't get much airplay, and yet it can be just as powerful over time, that you're things are changing, and you might need other people to tell you that that's happening. How was that for you, Brian? You've done a very gradual approach, right?
Well, I've had yes, I would say I'm not sure it's gradual with leaps in the,
Uh-huh.
there have been moments where I just sat there laughing hysterically by seeing what would happen if I just had absolutely no intention whatsoever. And there have been moments where I realized, and I like the term fundamental well-being that Jeffrey coined a lot, because to me, uh, that's what it feels like. It feels like the sense of well-being that's already there, that's fundamental to our nature and just temporarily covered up. And I found many instances have been able to just notice it and then more and more easily just pop there. That's been my experience. Have For the deepening process, is there should a client or a person who goes through the process have a certain amount of equanimity or fundamental well-being, and then what's the ultimate goal of the process?
Great question.
Well, I would say that it's been interesting since, for example, Rastal's been on a number of podcasts now outside of Perfectly Okay. So there is interest in this work from folks who are not in fundamental well-being but want to get there,
Mm-hmm.
and they're trickling in. Um, and you know, it's not difficult to guide a person into those feelings of well-being. We all have them. They may be covered up by, anxiety and situations in life, but everybody can access them, and that's just the starting point. So yes, one deepens from there. Whatever one sees in that first dive, if you will, can be very, very different in quality from the next sort of stop along the way. Did that answer your question?
Mm-hmm.
And in the little experience I've had guiding people and sinking in and Rostal and your technique, I often work with psychotherapy clients sometimes who are very anxious, and they'll all say, "Is there anything in your experience that feels relaxed or open or good?" And they'll say, "No, I'm just anxious all the time." I'll half jokingly, I started doing this. I'd say, "How's your elbow feel? Is it anxious? Is it tense?" And they'll go, "No, my elbow actually feels okay." Okay, well, so there's a feeling of okayness in your elbow. How about your arm? Any complaints about your right arm? It's okay too. And we gradually build this well-being or relaxation until they go, "Yeah, I feel really peaceful." Okay, well, focus on that, and over time, it works with somebody who might be coming to me for anxiety disorder or depression. And I love how the same technique works for somebody anywhere on the spectrum, from total anxiety to high levels of awakening. It's really a very flexible technique that way.
Apparently, who it doesn't work for are folks that are already in those very, very, very later locations. But it has been seen that maybe the direction of going down, which Ristal really stressed, is better. A better substitute for that is falling backwards. Just allowing yourself to fall backwards. I have found that Jeffrey's term of sinking in, and as he described it, as you would sink into a hot bath, to just completely let down into that with that kind of feeling, is as effective as the downward motion. And I will offer that in a session, whichever one works best for you. Try that. And if that doesn't work, try the falling back.
Yeah, I think it's useful to have different metaphors. I have a hot tub that I use every night. So the sinking in slowly to a hot tub works really well for me. I have a friend that does skydiving. And when I guided him, I said, just imagine you're jumping off from the plane into free fall. And that worked incredibly well for him.
Wow. That wouldn't do it for me.
No, me neither. But
Whatever
falling back,
works.
but I like falling back. And matter of fact, I think that would be a good metaphor for me because one famous Buddhist phrase that has always helped me is the term taking the half step back. When I just sort of sink back into and just sort of be the background and allow the foreground to be just as it is. That I find that's what does it for me.
Mm-hmm.
But do people then, so people are sinking in or falling back into what they're currently experiencing right now, right? I mean, is that it? Or does it really, you really want to target whatever good feelings or fundamental well-being that you have, or
Yes,
is it different for everybody?
We're asking them to connect with fundamental well-being, however it shows up in their system.
Okay.
And then start to really examine that and sink into that.
Right.
Yeah, it might be a good point just to sort of delineate here what might be sort of the difference between what you might call classic sinking in, right, which is just tuning into fundamental well-being, and the actual deepening process or protocol, which has a directionality to it. It's this is sort of what I consider to be really it seems almost too obvious, but really the innovation on this process that Rostal essentially discovered, just sort of seeing how far he could take it, which is basically that, once you're sunk into whatever is available to you, is what happens when you just allow your system to move wherever it wants to move, when you're no longer tethered by, the mind or sensations or anything like that. Where can it go? And it turns out that where it goes is somewhat predictable. It follows the pattern, in different ways for different people, and ends up at this place where, what we are provisionally calling persistent or inescapable equanimity sort of becomes your baseline. And so everything sort of gets, in a way, taken apart, kind of moved around, and then reintegrated as a whole, and sort of reorganizes on its own. And there's no one who decides to do that, who's figuring out what it should look like. You're simply sort of in the back seat, so to speak, although eventually there is no back, there is no seat, there's nobody in it. But that's a little bit what a metaphor for it might be, is that you're essentially just there in the flow of experience. So.
Oh, thank you so much for that delineation. That was so helpful. And also, as a matter of fact, as you were doing it, I was sensing it, right there and then. The idea that I felt like taking my hands off the steering wheel, allowing the system to go where it goes. And that sense of not trying to control things alone, I think is just so freeing. I imagine that's a big part of it.
A very big part of it.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if you think that short sessions of sinking in, a minute or something, or long sessions have more of the integrative effect in daily life, or is it a combination? Do you recommend that people do, hour meditations of sinking in, or 5 minutes of sinking in? What have you seen work best for people?
Well, our sessions are 90 minutes, and the bulk of that is doing the actual deepening process. And we'll usually do, anywhere from 1 to maybe 3 sort of dives into consciousness or fundamental well-being and see where you land. And it seems like the sort of a longer period like that does a couple of things. One of the things that seems to happen is that the mind sort of takes a break or takes a back seat in this process. And that's where I suspect that that's where a guide becomes helpful, is that it's sort of like you no longer, we take that on. We're sort of, I kind of think of it as being the Sherpa in this process, right? We're taking on the kind of figuring out all the strategy, all the analysis, all the like, is anything happening? Where am I? What's next? All that stuff. We take on that whole back end of things so that the person's system is just free to float wherever it's going to go. And it feels to me like a person's system who's not used to that has to acclimate to that. And so I suspect that if you're only doing really short sessions, it doesn't really get rewired in that way where it's actually acclimated to being free or loose long enough that an actual transition can take place. Yeah.
Good point. Yeah. Something I found when I was being guided in these sessions is, especially after I did it a couple times, is, as you said, Boris, tends to be a pretty predictable progression, which is, I think, surprising people, kind of like location 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, that there's a recognizable next things that are likely to happen as you deepen. And that's fascinating in of itself, but that you can't push the process. And one of the ingredients that makes it work is feeling completely grateful for just whatever you have right now. That you can't think, this is good, but I'm trying to get to the next place. That's pretty much the death to that process. So the one of the important ingredients is letting go of trying to get anywhere and just kind of being grateful for what is.
An open appreciation and sense of gratitude is integral to the process. Absolutely.
Yeah. And can be hard to get when you think you know where you want to go.
We break people of that immediately.
I mean, if that is sort of what we would consider the first form of resistance, is any idea about what should be happening, right? It's the primary illusion that has anything to do with where you may end up, right? The idea that you know what should happen. So we feel like that's for us to take on. And as long as the person can find some sense of some okayness and can find a sense of, like you just said, appreciation and openness, those are really like the lubricants and the catalysts for the process. And most people can tune into that to one degree or another. And as soon as you have the slightest taste of it, you're just directed to put your attention on it. And that allows it to allows you to fill up on it just by putting your attention on it.
Colette, I heard you say on the video that you were both on with the Perfectly Okay community Zoom meeting. You said deconditioning happens on its own. And I found that really fascinating. I've always thought that emotional health, I don't know about physical health, is what happens when you get out of the way and allow it. Is that similar to deconditioning happening on its own?
Deconditioning for me happened on its own. It happened in dreams. At about the 2-year mark, I started to have some very pointed dreams. It was almost magical. It was so succinct. And they still happen from time to time, but there was a period where there was a lot of that. Boris and I work very differently, and I think we attract different clients. Boris is a master at deconditioning. I think he can speak about it much better than I. What I find, and this is we're very different in this regard. I will let people go on for a while. And eventually I have found that they do work through, they do get past it. Whereas Boris he'll go in and just solve the whole thing. So we have very different approaches to that, but it is certainly true, Brian, that it's like you were saying earlier about, just finding all of a sudden something that was really irritating, just hysterically funny, things lose their attachment, they lose their meaning. Things are seen. This is my sort of take on it. If someone shows up in front of me that's behaving like a jerk, let's just say that, rather than my former response, which would be what a jerk, that person is showing up in front of me with everything that brought them to that type of behavior very present and very visible to me. And so the reaction is no longer there. There's a seeing of the big picture that comes with deepening, that comes with later locations. And the bigger the picture one has access to, the less cause there is for reaction.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes, there's a deeper understanding that comes. There's a deeper compassion that comes. There's a deeper allowance that comes. And it just seems to come with the territory, and not with any specific location. But the deeper one goes, it seems, the more that is a part of the experience. And it's really a blessing, I have to say.
And it sounds like you have fewer conditions on how the world should be. It's not just conditioning like how you've been affected by your past, but we have certain conditions about how people must behave in order for us to be happy. And it sounds like those have, gone away. And so people can be just the way they are.
Absolutely. Well said. Absolutely. Yeah.
And Boris, as a parent master at deconditioning, what is Colette referring to there?
Well, maybe it's my engineering, inclination or kind of interest in the mechanics of things. That for me, part of my process for myself has been sort of looking at what are the underlying mechanisms of things, like how we behave, what we, the beliefs that are responsible seemingly for how we interpret and then respond to things. That was what really got me into the human potential stuff even before I heard anything or knew anything about meditation or awakening. And then also just understanding what are the mechanisms responsible for what, the Buddhists call suffering. And so my background over the last few years has also been heavily influenced by the 10 fetters inquiry model that many people are now familiar with. There's a bunch of people now teaching it and providing guiding in that. So for me, it feels like I'm sort of into efficiency. So for me, it feels like if something is going on, it's like if you go inside and look at what's underneath all that, and you can sort of turn that or unwind it directly, then it's kind of like it's pulling out the Jenga piece, right? Where like the whole thing it depends on this particular function. And if you pull out the pins just right, the whole thing falls apart. So it's less about working with any particular situation. In fact, I think you can do deconditioning without any mental construction or any kind of narrative whatsoever, if you're simply working with sort of the somatic and sort of meta-somatic elements of your experience. And you can do that in real time. You don't need to expose yourself or to think of something and to raise your nervous system to this disturbed state in order to do that. So that's sort of how I like to work. And I generally will tune into what seems to be the most obvious or most poignant pin, if you will, in someone's system, which is ready to be pulled.
Is that mostly in a somatic way or a belief way? How would you?
It's sort of a combination of both, right? So there's always a somatic element, and that's super helpful to become familiar with. What is it like to actually experience, to actually feel things, right? Feel things in your body. How is it happening? Where is it happening? To not avoid feeling is like a huge step, right? Once you're able to do that, the whole world opens up, because now you can actually, you're no longer bouncing off of everything, constantly being like pricked by the world, right? Now you're actually able to feel whatever's happening. And that leads to usually some sort of inquiry into, the mechanism where some discomfort creates a kind of reaction, an automated reaction to something that's responsible for this feeling of whole plethora of illusions about our self-worth, how the world works, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah. Something at the conference, Angelo DeLullo was speaking, and he said something that really hit me. He said, really, all your suffering is based on a untrue idea that you're a separate individual. If you just see through that, game over.
Yeah.
And for those minutes that he was talking, that was obvious. Like, well, that's so obvious. How do we not see that? And then, of course, the old Jonathan came back roaring and screaming. which brings me to the next question, which is, how do you deal with people's resistance?
Well, Colette, do you want to
No.
jump in on this? Okay.
She wants to resist that question.
No, you go
there's
first.
There's kind of a sort of a prescribed approach to it, which we developed with Rostel, which is basically that anything that comes up, and mind you, this whole process is sort of unique because we're not trying to avoid anything or direct anything. So whatever comes up in the session is perfect fodder for whatever's going to happen in the session. So whether it's smooth sailing down through all these layers or levels or regions, or something pops up that you kind of recognize, this familiar thing that I am always bouncing off of. The general approach is that if you are able to keep in your awareness or keep in your attention both this feeling of okayness, however it's showing up, however slight or intense, and whatever's coming up as resistance, tension, discomfort, whatever, when the two meet, there's sort of what do you call that? When you
neutralizing?
When they used to mix metals together. Alchemy. There's a kind of alchemy that seems to kind of take place where the resistance or the tension or the discomfort is sort of bathed in or informed by, or whatever you want to call it, by this sense of okayness, which is actually, much more foundational and not situational, not dependent on any factors, right? So it seems kind of obvious that you, in a way, this is not a perfect analogy or metaphor, but that bigger field or whatever can sort of subsume and dissolve whatever is sort of small in proportion to that. And that's not by thinking about it or comparing it. It's by simply introducing this localized small thing to this more foundational sort of infinite or endless kind of thing.
Well said. Yeah. And I noticed that when you put peace together with a trauma or something that's anxiety provoking, they kind of the lower vibration, we'll call it, the trauma or the anxiety, dissolves. Yeah.
And can I speak to that a bit?
Mm-hmm.
I'm realizing as Boris is speaking why it's so difficult for me to articulate what happens when resistance is met. And, not to go woo here, but I was trained in energy healing some 30 years ago by Barbara Brennan. And that has been my profession largely for all these years. And so I can't separate that from this process. So if I'm seeing resistance or feeling trauma embedded, there's a meeting of it energetically from this to that. There's a holding of it. There's a caring for it. There's a tenderness that's transmitted. That's evoked. And I found that when two or more are present with an intention a third thing happens, and that's the unwinding of whatever stands in the way of the meeting of that intention. So it's not mm, a thought process for me. It's not a strategy, but it's a trained seeing and meeting. So, and that's how our sessions, I think, are different, and that's why we complement each other. And if I come across someone for whom right away they're telling me I've got a lot of resistance, I will suggest that they have an introductory session with Boris, because I know that he's as I said, he's very masterful at that. Whereas if it's somebody who's perhaps more open energetically and more able to experience things energetically, it would be easier for me to work on that level with them than somebody who's just like, yeah, I've got resistance. I'm not going to go anywhere with this.
Oh, well said.
Yeah, if you'll allow me a little bit of a diversion into my personal experience, but what Colette said really reminded me of, there was a certain point in my kind of progression of things where I just noticed that the system was sort of my system, or the overall system was naturally responding to things that were like, conflict or tension or resistance with sort of the perfect counterpart to it, right? So something would arise, some disappointment or stress or sadness or something like that. And I would notice this like opposite, equal or greater force come up that sort of is like Colette said, is sort of like almost mothering, this cosmic mother or parent or supportive infrastructure that comes up to meet it and provides just the perfect antidote, right? And what happens when your system is sort of more free and clear of all the thoughts and all the this is good or this is bad and says this about me or not, you're actually just experiencing that counterforce arising. So each sort of stimulus of something that's, quote unquote negative is an opportunity to experience like the counterforce or the counterpart in all its glory. It's quite interesting what happens. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Reminds me, the comedian Louis C.K. Has a part about that where if you could just not resist sadness, beauty will come to meet that at some point. It's popular. If you have YouTube, you can put in Louis C.K. cell phone, and it's a hysterically funny and very profound bit about that, which our listeners might want to be watch. Any last questions, Brian, that we haven't covered that you're curious about?
I am curious about one thing. Again, Colette, when I watched that video on YouTube of when you and Boris were talking to the Perfectly Okay community, you had a quote that really struck me and is very dear to my heart. And the quote was, "You don't want to be focusing on what's wrong. You want to be letting what's right have its way with you." And for me, this was my huge breakthrough, and also, but I think for Jonathan, it's been quite different. And this is one of the differences between Jonathan and me, his experience with finding where your flaws are, and mine experience was stop focusing on the flaws, and so I'm wondering if we might expand upon that a little bit.
Well, that is what deepening is all about, because we're focusing directly on what's bringing happiness, what's bringing peace, what's bringing equanimity, what's bringing joy and bliss even. And we're just expanding that. And that does have its way with one. That absolutely has. I mean, it's having its way with me now. Just you saying, I didn't remember saying that, but I like that I said it. It feels really good, doesn't it?
It does. It does. It was like, oh, this is a woman after my own heart.
This is how you know you're past a certain point in the progression, when you have no idea. You don't recognize what someone tells you said a day ago.
Right. That's so true. What Brian brought up, we've often called the two-wing analogy, that some people focus on what's wrong with them or what's in the way. Some people focus on, what feels good or peaceful. And what I find is whatever your tendency is, your personality's tendency is, it's best to put a little bit more energy on the opposite side. So for me, I was always like an optimist, like, uh, Pollyannish in a certain way. And so focusing on flaws and unconscious behavior was very helpful because that balanced me out. Brian was kind of, a depressed guy focusing on those things. So when he got that message, it was like, wow, now we have two wings. With two wings, we can really soar. If you only have one wing, you're likely to go around in circles and then crash.
And there's a coach for everyone.
There's a coach for everyone. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to cover? We definitely want to get how people can contact you, but anything that you would like to say that we didn't talk about?
Well, I would like to express my deep, deep gratitude for those that came before us in this process. First and foremost, Jeffrey Martin. We wouldn't be sitting here without Jeffrey. And Rastal, who just, one day reached out to us. I still don't know why, but said, do you want to work with me? Do you want to train with me? And it's been a real gift ever since. We have done very little to make this happen. It has dropped in our laps, and we have followed threads here and there, and it's been super, super rewarding. And having gone through Jeffrey's mentor program, having that be sort of abruptly truncated, a lot of would-be mentors were kind of left, well, what do we do now? And so to have this platform offered to us to connect with people in the community, it's just been amazing. It's just been amazing.
Well, I could see that both of you have the right energy for this, and I think Russell made a great decision that way. But what were you going to say, Boris?
Well, Colette's kind of pulling me into the heart center, gratitude, appreciation, fullness thread of things, which kind of knocks me off balance here. I prefer to stay here a little more linear, so I can keep speaking to you guys. But let me try. I was thinking of like, what's the possibilities, with this process? Like, what's the potential here? There is kind of a somewhat predictable progression where people move through these different stages or regions to a certain point. And I find that, some people kind of get to that quote unquote end point, and they're kind of like, okay, I'm done. Everything's good. There's no such thing as a problem anymore, right? And that sort of seems to be the prevailing sense of things for everybody, right? And for some people, there can arise a question or a curiosity about like, okay, what else, right? So now that you are sort of no longer preoccupied with making the world the way you think it should be, you can your attention might gravitate towards what could be, right? And so for me, that's sort of my current area of exploration and sort of working, the sort of what's on the horizon for me, working with people who have kind of gone through the process and are interested in what else is possible. So we're working on some stuff around like optimization, integration, and sort of playing with creation, those sorts of things. So I think this is sort of I don't want to diminish the process at all, but to me, it's like this is sort of the first step, right? And the jumping off point for what else might happen. And once you're sort of cleared out what you might call the structure of suffering or the problem, the world as a problem, your system just feels so much more free to actually explore some of these things you read about or you might have encountered and you try to use to make yourself feel better, but they actually contain these germs of possibility to explore, a whole different cornucopia of experience, I think. So anyway, that's my shtick right now.
Well, said like a true awareness explorer, and I feel honored that I know both of you and really support what you're doing. So May the explorations keep on deepening.
Thank you,
Thank
Jonathan.
you. Yeah, thank you guys.
Yeah. How can our listeners get hold of each of you? We start with you, Colette.
I have my personal website is colettemartin.me. That's more for energy work and that sort of thing. As far as the deepening protocol is concerned, it is thedeepeningprotocol.com. And we're just about to post. We've gone from a sort of a session by session basis to really looking into a program, an actual program where there's more consistent deepening. So that's about to be posted. We'll have some new info up there very soon. But it's
Okay.
thedeepeningprotocol.com.
Great. And it should be colettemartin.notme.
That they don't have that.
Yeah,
Jonathan.
well, we'll have to create that.
A whole new domain.
No one.
No one here.
whatsoever.
Yeah.
No one
That's a non-dual boo-boo, I think.
Yeah.
.me. I don't know about that.
Yeah.
And Boris, should people reach you through the same website or?
Yeah, the deepening protocol is where you can make contact. If anyone has questions, you can fill out the contact form there. Our schedules are up there if anyone wants to actually partake in this coaching process. We're also working on a training program for training coaches. Our goal is really to propagate this process as far and wide. It's not ours. We don't own it. We happen to be involved in it, but hopefully we'll just spread it far and wide, and people will take it up and use it themselves, just like you've started experimenting with, Jonathan. So that's the next step. Yeah.
Great. And speaking of disseminating it, you're about to do a guided meditation using Brian as an example of how you might work with someone. I just want to mention thank you to our Patreon supporters. And we send a bunch of free stuff. Now we're sending these summaries of the podcast, an AI summary, which is awesomely good to our Patreon supporters. So if you're interested in that, go to patreon.com/awareness explorers. But with all that said, Boris, why don't you take it from here?
All right. So I'll just guide you, Brian, but everyone should just listen along and experience this for yourself. So yeah, basically, Brian, you just want to kind of relax yourself, find a comfortable seat there. Maybe you're already comfortable, maybe you're already relaxed, so you got a head start, and you might just take a couple of deeper breaths just to see what that's like, and just to notice what it's like, to breathe, to sit, to be. And you might find yourself just kind of gently, without any effort and without any intention in particular, just kind of easing into the sitting itself. You might allow your eyes to close if that feels right. And by the way, we always tell people that whatever we suggest, if at any point you feel like doing something else, or it doesn't make sense, it doesn't resonate, absolutely do what feels right. So that's the guidance, overall guidance. But as you find a comfortable seat there, you might feel that kind of wave of relaxation moving down, maybe from the top of your head, down your ears, your cheekbones, your neck, your shoulders, your arms, and your entire torso, just allowing it to naturally and gradually and gently move through the body. And here you're just going to see what's it like just to sit without having to do anything, decide anything, direct anything. And then you just ask yourself, do I feel fundamentally okay? Does everything feel all right now? And when you do that, you might notice where that answer comes from. Does it feel like it's inside, all around you, everywhere, or everything? All of the above? And just see if there's a sense of appreciation or even gratitude for that, just for having access to that, for being able to experience that. And as you put your attention on that feeling of okayness or stillness or peace or freedom or joyfulness, you might notice that it starts to spread out or expand all on its own. And so all we're asking you to do is just to notice that without any expectation, without any effort, without any figuring anything out. And then you might notice if there's a particular quality to that sense or to that atmosphere, whether it feels still or quiet or open or spacious or loving or expansive or full of wonder. You're just going to allow yourself to pay attention to that, to notice that. And you might notice that it starts to fill out the foreground of your attention and take up more and more of your awareness. And just notice how with each breath, it just continues to unfold, to expand, all without any effort on your part. And here you might start to notice that this process is just as effortless and easeful as breathing itself. And if it feels appropriate, it feels okay, you might just see if an answer comes forth describing what quality do you notice here? How would you describe it? And if you can do it without pulling yourself out of it, without disrupting your experience, you might even verbalize it, share it with us.
Love.
Great. Okay. So you might feel like it's healing or supportive or just interesting to just rest in the love for a moment. You might notice that it's complete or pervasive or expansive or unending. And you might see if there's an openness or a curiosity about what else might show up. What else might arise? What might looking or dropping down beneath this love, what might it reveal? If it feels okay, there isn't any tension or doubt or resistance, you might just allow yourself to explore what's beneath this love. You might find yourself sort of lowering yourself or sliding or dropping down through or into this love. And just allowing each breath to move you further and further and further through this love or whatever you're experiencing. And then you might notice what else starts to show up beneath this experience, beneath this quality. Might see if there's an openness to that, a curiosity, an interest, a welcoming. And that with each breath, just allowing it to rise, to unfold, to move into your attention, move into the foreground. It might be a bubbling up or an opening or a warmth or even an explosion or something much more subtle. And just allowing yourself with each breath to move deeper and deeper into this new quality, whatever's showing up. You don't need to label it. You don't need to understand it. You don't need to know anything about it. And you might notice it moving more and more into the foreground with each breath until it starts to fill up your entire awareness, your entire experience. You might notice whatever was there before just starts to gently and naturally move to the background. Just making space, making way for what's showing up now. And if you notice any thoughts or discomfort or tension showing up, and just noticing that and just letting it be. Bringing your attention back to this new experience, this new quality. And then with every breath, just allowing yourself to settle in here, to come to rest here. Make yourself at home here. You might notice whatever's there permeating your whole system, your entire awareness, maybe your body, whatever you experience. And you might just notice how you don't have to leave anything out here. You don't have to exclude anything. You might invite your whole system to participate in this. If anything feels like it's holding on, holding back, just acknowledging it, just recognizing it. And whenever it starts to feel like it's settled or stabilized, enjoying that rest for a moment. And then just very gently, very gradually, you might start to feel your fingers, your toes, and just noticing what that's like from this experience. What do those feel like? You might notice some other sensations as you start to just feel the rest of the body, the whole complex of sensations, seeing what that's like. And whenever it feels right, you might move your fingers or your toes a little bit. You might feel your elbows and move your arms a little bit, seeing what that's like. And then just gently allowing the other senses in. So the sounds, you might notice the sound of my voice or other sounds in the environment, what that's like here. And just gradually, gently inviting in the other senses. So you might start to very, very gently open your eyes to allow some light in, just to see what that's like. And then you might open them a little bit more. So you start to notice colors and shapes. And just allowing your attention then to move between all the senses. You might notice sensation, you might notice sight, you might notice sounds, smells, thoughts, and just notice that it's all part of this. And here, typically at this point, we would sort of go into a bit of an inquiry to see where the person is in terms of their experience. We'll just do a very abbreviated form of that, just to kind of give you a sense of orientation. So you might share with us, Brian, what you're noticing, if anything in particular, just about your experience in general.
I found that, well, I'm very relaxed. There's also some energy releasing, some shaking throughout laughter. But the dropping below love was amazing, and I don't have any words to describe it, because what was there was love was still a concept, and below it was conceptlessness, concept freeness, this spacious, and words, no words can describe it. And then when you asked me to start moving my fingers and toes, they were like that concept free nothingness that is everything, just moving itself.
Beautiful.
Very moving.
Great. Yeah. So this is a good time for a lot of people, if they've had any kind of glimpse or movement in their system, to really just kind of rest there. Mm-hmm. And just to pay attention to how experience is from here. So you can pay attention to your senses, to whether there's any mind activity, how your memory may or may not be working, how relating to others might work, how moving your body might seem. All those things can just shift in subtle or more pronounced ways. And just paying attention to that is really powerful for integrating and really making this a holistic process that touches your entire experience, not just head to toe, but from concept to conceptualness and conceptuallessness. and everything in between. So, yeah, beautiful.
That was great to watch, and I tagged along pretty well. And I also experienced the love when Brian said that, and then the undescribable, whatever you want to call the thing under love. We'll call it the indescribable thing.
It's a thing, that thing.
Yeah, that thing. That thingless thing.
It's a thing.
Yeah.
You're in the subway now. Slow subway.
Great
Well,
work,
there's-
Brian. Great work.
Awesome. The glasses are all fogged up.
Awesome.
It has been
Great.
such a joy. I really appreciate how well you both work together as the two wings, and how well you describe the undescribable thing.
Yeah. Thank you,
you.
Jonathan.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having us, you guys.
It was
Total
really
delight. Thank you so much for this conversation.
And thank our listeners for listening in and being fellow explorers on this path. And until next time, keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
Thank you for listening to Awareness Explorers. To learn more, you can check out our website at awarenessexplorers.com. Please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app. We'd love it if you would post a review. And please share our link on Facebook and with family and friends, because knowing yourself as awareness is the greatest gift you can give yourself or someone you love.